Very quickly, I just want to, obviously we have not very much time, and I'm trying really, in the brief time I have to really just make one major point. And that is an effort to try and understand the concept of industry itself and the methodologies we may need to put together to understand what industry and the status of industry itself is in places in Asia. The example that I'm going to provide is an example from the city of Bombay, which along with the city of Calcutta had provided the best instances of industrial capital. In Bombay it was the textile industry, and in Calcutta it was the jute industry. And I want to start with a little example which I think is iconic of the problem I'm trying to put before you. This was the height of the textile strike in Bombay, which I'm going to say a little bit more about. And a very important sort of trade union activist in Bombay was once sitting with me in my house, and he was saying, "What do you think industry is?" And I said, "Well, it's all these workers and workforce and the communist unions and so on." And he walked into my kitchen and he opened my refrigerator and he said, "Let me tell you how your fridge is made." And he showed me how bit by bit, almost 80% of my fridge was assembled by what you would call pre-industrial conditions, by structures of artisanal produce, very often in slums and located in various kinds of, what can you say, within that particular language, semi-capitalist structures. And he wanted to make an argument as to how, whether we're talking about motor cars or we're talking about refrigerators, very often the industrial stage in the entire production process is not only just the last one, it's the only stage in which the markup of the value of the commodity actually goes into what I'm paying. So while the company that's doing the industrial thing is only doing one stage in the process, they're the ones who get most of the profit. This idea of industrial production in a place like Bombay, and I'm not terribly sure, at that time, of course, we're buying Philips refrigerators, today we're buying Samsung and Hyundai. I'm not terribly sure the situation has changed. This kind of condition of industrial production cocooned by various kinds of practices and productions that you might see as pre-industrial or dubiously industrial, supporting that industrial structure. And when you have deindustrialization, you actually have an increasing shift from that industrial structure into more and more of these ancillary mechanisms being put in place. And the last thing, that these so-called ancillary mechanisms around the industrial are what we are today calling the cultural industry. This model is what I want to primarily explore as we speak. The textile strike I'm referring to took place in Bombay in 1982. The textile industry in Bombay, and you have an image here of one second, how do I get this? The district of Girangaon, as it was known, actually saw probably one of the largest examples of industrial action in the European sense of the term. In 1982, the legendary textile strike that lasted over 1 year. The textile industry in Bombay goes back to the mid-19th century and has seen an extraordinary history both of industrialization and of industrial working class action. The historian Raj Chandavarkar, whose work I'm going to largely borrow from for this argument, writes that since at least the 1880s, Girangaon had witnessed industrial action of a scale that almost is unmatched anywhere in the world. During the First World War and its immediate aftermath, strikes, working class strikes, occurred with increasing frequency both within the industry and outside, culminating in the general strikes of 1919 and 1920. And from the late 20s onwards, especially during the 28 strike, the labor movement came to be dominated by a communist leadership. In other words, this was industrial working class action in the sense in which you would understand it. Marxism understood it, and labor history would understand it. The link between this particular kind of industrial action, such as what you see here, and the peasantry of the state is, however, a much more complicated one than what appears. The 1982 strike of Girangaon was the last major textile strike because the industry came to an end, more or less, in the sense in which we understood it from the mid-19th century onwards. It was sustained for a year. Indeed, the strike was never called off. but the strike simply dissipated. By the time it collapsed, the textile industry had begun to be dismantled. What is curious was that when the strike ended, it was remarkable that the closure of the industry in the leading center of India's textile industry resulted in no appreciable decline in the availability of cloth or the output of cloth. Power loom factories, this is a very famous painting by Sudhir Patwardhan showing you Girangaon in Vileparle. Power loom factories achieved far more easily and far more flexibly the composition of output and deployment of labor that the composite mills had long pursued with so much determination and even greater difficulty. By employing far smaller numbers of workers, mostly women, such production conditions often escape the regulation of the established structures of mills, and mill owners found that they could spin yarn and outsource cloth production or even diversify into power looms themselves. It's a very strange question as to what actually replaces an industry of such a large scale. What can happen when you have deindustrialization in this sense of the term? You must ask, as historians in India have done, were we industrialized at all? Is this industrialization in the sense in which we understand it? Let me suggest two things here. One is that the workers very often moved back into being peasants in some form or the other. And indeed, Chandavarkar suggests that the industrial action that the 1982 strike had shown was premised on the assumption that workers could depend heavily on their rural and peasant origins. And such origins often translated not only into what existed in the countryside, in villages, but actually into the social organization of the urban neighborhood itself. The social contours of Girangaon were influenced by the close connections that workers' families maintained between the urban neighborhood and their rural base. Again, a very, very famous Sudhir Patwardhan painting, establishing, if you like, the kind of conditions of living that surround the workplace, which is apparently intrinsic to this particular explanation of this particular kind of industrialization. Such a peasant link to the workforce, the idea that a workforce is inherently and essentially a peasantry, rather than a working class in the full sense of the term, was also influenced by the labor policies and business strategies of the mill owners in Bombay. Inhospitable and sometimes arbitrary changing conditions of work, uncertain and irregular employment, low wages made it essential for workers to live near their places of employment, which is something that Bombay has historically seen and which is something that continues to exist. The mills hired labor according to need, which varied not only from day to day, but at times fluctuated in a single day within the same mill. Notionally, at least, workers were hired at the mill gates every single day. You'd hire a person for the day in that day. But only the most optimistic and foolhardy could rely upon the permanence of their employment. Their social conditions built up in the neighborhood then often originated in the affinities of caste, kinship, and village, became vital to workers both in their attempts to find jobs, housing, and credit, and seeking support in times of unemployment, sickness, or family crisis. This kind of idea of the neighborhood, or this particular idea of, if you like, the village in the city, the village in the very heart of the city, is something that many people have attempted to explain. This is a sequence from a very famous Saeed Mirza film called Salim Langde Ve Matro, where the lovers are sitting in this chawl, just bang in the middle of the industry, the textile that they work in. The artist Jitish Kalat, and many artists of this kind, and many people have attempted to try and find a form of urban mapping that tries to describe this experience. I'm particularly interested in the work of these three artists, Ranjit Kandalgaonkar, Aditya Potluri, and Saurav Vaya, who have attempted to find a structure of mapping the city of Bombay in a way that would accommodate this definition of a city within a city, or a village within a city, or the kind of multiple structures of employment occupying different hierarchies of labor within the same space, which is what we must understand as industrialism. most workers at this point of time were migrants to the city. As far back as 1921, 84% of the city's population had been born outside Bombay. 50 years later, the city's labor force still consisted almost entirely of rural migrants. This particular pattern for young males to come into the city, find work, send money back home, back to the countryside, and often go back into the countryside and sort of return to their real or imagined plots of land. This particular structure of migration was to determine this particular image of the working class. Rajchandra extrapolates from this particular experience to ask as to what models of industrialization we have in a place like India. He says that models of industrialization and social change, whether Marxist or functionalist, have been derived almost exclusively from very particular European examples, and he says not only European but really British examples. Social theories came to be constructed upon a specific reading of a particular and in some respects unique historical development, creating as a result numerous universal postulates for which much of the rest of the world had to define itself either as an exception to it or in opposition to it. The historical example of India now offers an interesting kind of an alternative historical structure for industrialism itself, which I think we need to understand before we understand cultural industries. He says that in conventional terms, India was substantially on the road to industrialism from the mid-19th century onwards, without perhaps having reached this destination. And this would suggest that we should either understand industrialization in India, and of course as a result in a number of other places, both in South Asia and East Asia, as special cases requiring special models of their own, or suggest that existing models of industrialization may be in need of revision. In India, for example, he suggests that all of the forces of industrialism, including the different hierarchies or registers of industrialism, were working together at the same time and very often showed signs of acceleration in the 19th century, but almost certainly went back to pre-colonial conditions. So, you actually could look at industrialization with very different time spans than what Europe could provide. I want to use this to really make the second and I think more substantive point, which is, if you see within the idea of a workforce a peasant, or if you see, for example, a relationship of worker to the category of artisan, the anonymous artisan, I think in Lee Kong's example this morning about the furniture worker, the question whether the carpenter comes in on that or not is an interesting question. As occupying the unstable space within this particular structure of production, I think that this actually takes us to a very different historical register of what we are today calling the culture industry. The artisan has been one of the most elusive figures in Indian history. He is a figure that, like a chimera, appears and disappears at different points in Indian history, and you can actually track back the artisan almost certainly to periods when deindustrialization takes place. The artisan sort of seems to come to the fore at a time of deindustrialization, and often as a savior figure when deindustrialization happens, when the worker, if you like, disappears. I'm interested now in 4 periods, and I will just quickly highlight those 4 periods as constituting the origins of the kind of culture industry we're thinking of today. And by the way, every one of us wearing Fab India shirts, including myself, please remember you're looking at that history. Let me start by invoking my artisan in Mughal India. Irfan Habib's classic essay on the potentialities of capitalist development in the economy of Mughal India speaks of karkhanas, or factories, private factories in Mughal society thus. The emperor, the Mughal emperor, and his nobles were generous patrons of the professions and art. Through pensions or gifts, they maintained scholars, poets, theologians, physicians, painters, musicians, and dancers. Amongst their requirements were the need of articles of furniture and decoration, as well as personal use, which must have been truly great. The emphasis was on the most expensive material and the finest workmanship. Many of the articles the nobles needed came from their own workshops, where the artisans were set to work under close supervision of material provided by the nobles. What is astonishing, says Habib, in this period of time, was that the artisan was destitute of tools. He suggests that deindustrialization actually more or less begins at this point of time. The development of tools seem to be in inverse ratio to the skill of the artisans, and I think this applies to the refrigerator manufacturer today as well. But in spite of indifferent tools, they still managed to produce works of the highest quality. The real issue was that the development of skill involved extreme skill specialization, and he speaks of 100 crafts in Agra for a job which one man would do in Holland. Here passes through 4 men's hands before it is finished. As a result, artisans in India, including the famous craftsmen who did all these carpets and things that we valorize so much, were thought to be good at imitation, but not at designing anything themselves, which meant, in turn, that the manufacture of certain mechanical devices, such as clocks, were not even attempted, even in imitation in India. So you could make carpets, but not clocks. Artisans had certain kinds of abilities, but not others. Moving to my second example, notwithstanding these particular conditions, we saw at the onset of the Industrial Revolution in Britain a thriving Indian industry. I want to move then to the second stage here, which is when you have the high era of industrialization in Britain. Bipin Chandra shows how the ruin of artisans, and this is a standard line that's made, that industrialization in Britain ruined the Indian artisan. And more generally, the decline of handicrafts in the spinning industry, leading to the penury of the peasant and the artisan, is one of the founding phenomena determining colonial Indian economic history. It turns out not to be so. The Great Exhibition of 1851 had happened in England at the Crystal Palace, and the Department of Science and Art founded in its wake the headquarters for what Arindam Datta calls a gargantuan enterprise, are today well known as the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Royal College of Art. Arindam Datta, actually sort of talking about this particular history, speaks of the colonial artisan, far from being eliminated by colonialism, epitomized the anthropological armature on which notions of British imperial responsibility turned. As a figure of difference, the artisan in this time does not disappear with the advent of British industrialism. Rather, it appears within industrialism. The imago of the Oriental artisan is born and bred in the anthropological chrysalis of industrial capitalism. If for Marx, the artisan had to be violently alienated from custom before she came to an understanding of herself as the agent of capital, for the Department of Science and Art in England, which is the major figure for the Victoria and Albert Museum, industry could only succeed if the disjunction between artisan and industrial worker was properly eliminated and reintegrated as an unruffled continuity. This link is something that I think is crucial here, because I think that we cannot understand the cultural industry as it comes to be occupied in a place like Bombay without seeing this particular history. And so Arindam Datta suggests that the artisan now becomes almost a futuristic figure, a cyborg structure within the narratives of modernization. I move to the third of my 4 stages. We move to development. This is the era of high development. Very often, the process of deindustrialization, in particularly Bombay, again, Raj Chandavarkar speaks of as taking place in the 1940s with the decline of the textile industries. Although 1982, the Textile Strike I spoke about earlier, is often seen as the final death knell of the industry. He says this was actually long before, already in place. Economic policy that we had in India from the late 50s or early 60s speaks of a certain sort of civilization or cultural role that different cultures have. This is important because we're not really speaking of the arts and culture chapter in the 23rd sort of volume or 23rd chapter of national cultural policy. This is the basis upon which Indian planning is taking place in 1961. We're looking at a situation in which values are such values, associated, moral and ethical values associated with this kind of traditional knowledge are a part of India's thinking, and that thinking is directed to, at one level, scientific and technological civilization, and the question is how to bring a synthesis between this kind of traditional knowledge on the one hand and modernity on the other. So you have actually a whole sort of structure of Gandhi and Tagore invoked to be able to make this kind of change happen. I just wanted to very quickly summarize that cultural policy in early planning documents includes the management and upgradation of cultural production, the need to create relevant institutions who can do it, the protection of cultural practitioners, and the marketing of cultural resources. These are, if you like, the cornerstones of developmental policy, and you can already see the preconditions of a cultural industry in the way that the Indian state is thinking about this at this point of time. I'll just move to a much more recent document. Sorry, 2 minutes. Okay, I'll take 2 more minutes. This is the Ford Foundation speaking in 2000. This is in the 1960s, quoted in 2002. The successful development of new nations includes and depends on cultural, intellectual factors, and new nations seek to discover their own cultures and to discover greater clarity, etc., using these kinds of legacies. I'll conclude with the much more recent situation, which is when we are arriving at the cultural industry upfront. I just wanted to end with a planning commission document that was put together in 2006, which produces this kind of thing about the kinds of pros and cons of the Indian cultural industry. What has been a startling development is that it seems to suggest that of the 110 crores, which is, I suppose, 1.2 billion people, which is the population, it says that whereas agriculture employs 24 crores, which is about 240 million people, organized industry and services has 110 million people. It says self-organized household, artisanal, and legacy industries occupy a population of 150 million people in India, and whereas it has a larger population that is employed in these industries, the worth of this to the GDP is only 14%, whereas organized industry is 66%. You can, in fact, now get, if you like, a kind of a resonance of at least, I think, a 300-year history when you start defining it like that. And I think there's a whole series of consequences, I think, to this particular structure, which seems to fundamentally sort of replace the kinds of teleologies of the culture industry within European deindustrialization, which we need to think about. Thank you very much.